This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Today's show of Agriculture Today takes the time to recognize the legacy of radio at Kansas State University with K-State Broadcasting Professor Emeritus Steve Smethers and Kansas radio broadcaster Ed Klimeck. In the first segment, the pair discuss how radio started at K-State. The conversation with Steve and Ed continues as they finish discussing key events in the history of K-State Radio and begin recognizing people during that time. They end today's show by previewing an event that has been put together to celebrate a century of sound and service of radio from Kansas State University. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and today's a special show when it comes to radio for Kansas State University, as we'll take the time to celebrate today the 100-year radio legacy at K-State. While we talk about it today and some of the history behind it, there will be a public celebration taking place in September that we'll share more about on later in today's show. Agriculture Today is part of this 100-year legacy and is the only remaining daily program from the KSAC-KKSU era. We will take the time to recognize 100 years of Agriculture Today later this year. And to talk about the century of sound and service at Kansas State University is K-State Broadcasting Professor Emeritus Steve Smethers and Kansas radio broadcaster Ed Klimeck. Steve, Ed, thank you both so much for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you for having us.
It's great to be here.
As we celebrate a century of radio at K-State, wanting to go back when it started, Steve, to December 1st, 1924, and how did radio at K-State begin?
You know, Shelby, I just spoke to a group downtown and told them something that's very interesting to think about. Radio was the very first alternative platform. Think about it. And radio came on the scene, and everybody understood that radio was a massive tool to be able to inform people. There was a way to make money with radio. We also understood that. And for a place like K-State, where you're trying to reach your constituencies, this mission of bringing the university to the farmer, you know, you really didn't have much cheaper way of doing it than a radio station. And we've seen radio stations go on the air for practical purposes elsewhere, for doing various things, because back then, nobody could afford to do a newspaper, you know, and you had to be able to have a way of being able to reach the audience. So having the alternate platform there was a big thing that K-State understood from the very start. This university, for example, in 1915, had a radio station called 9YV that gave weather to farmers in Morse code. I don't know how those farmers understood Morse code. Actually, I do, because the university actually did some training in deciphering Morse code for people. But, you know, as cryptic as that sounds, think about what that really means. Here's the university understanding its audience, understanding its agricultural roots, and understanding that farmers live and die by the weather, and if there's any way at all to disseminate that information to people, that was a very important thing to do. And the university tried for 1 year a radio station that was talk and not Morse code. In 1920, there was a little station that went on the air called WTG, and that was run by the physics department, and nobody really knew what to do with it, and so that radio station kind of went by the wayside. Down the road in Milford, there was a guy named John Brinkley, Dr. John Brinkley, who put a radio station on the air. Now, he was a quack physician, and Dr. Brinkley, we won't go into what he did, but what we will talk about is the fact that Brinkley clearly understood that there was so much value in being able to have information on the air that people cared about. He understood the localism of broadcasting very keenly. There are accounts, for example, of high school singing groups being heard on Brinkley's station, which was called KFKB. That stood for Kansas First and Kansas Best, when it really was neither. But anyway, that was probably debatable. But Brinkley would have various high school choirs, various community choirs and orchestras on the air. And he understood that Kansas State Agricultural College was wanting to get into the distance education business, to be able to offer classes by radio. And so his radio airwaves were offered to various professors who might want to try to teach courses by radio. I don't know what you think. I don't know that I could even imagine taking a course by radio. It's probably dry as milk toast. And I sure wouldn't want to teach a class by radio either. But at that time, it was the alternative platform. It's what you had. And so when you look today at the Division of Continuing Education and then the global campus at K-State, K-State was the very first public institution to understand that radio or some type of alternative medium could be used to actually take not only information to the people, but to take education to the people as well. And so the university did that. So they operated with Dr. Brinkley for about a year and a half. It was kind of a bad deal because back then the roads were dirt and you had to try to get to Milford to do your lectures. And that just didn't work very well. And so the university was all about putting its own station on the air. And so they applied to Herbert Hoover, who was Commerce Secretary at the time, back in the days before the Federal Radio Commission. If you want to put a station on the air, you send a postcard to Herbert Hoover. He'd say, okay, go ahead and put her on the air. So in 1924, December the 1st, KSAC went on the air. And that's how we got into the broadcasting business here at K-State.
And this program, called The College on the Air, soon expanded in 1947. And how did that expansion take place? Well,
the expansion really was twofold. First of all, the university realized what they had sitting there. They realized that this really was an important thing. It was a great way to reach the rural constituents that had proven to be very successful. They also realized that it extended the influence of the university. And so they applied in 1947 for an increase in power from 1,000 watts to 5,000 watts of power. Now, on the AM band, your signal goes further, because of the way AM signals are transmitted. The other thing they did that was gold was they went to a lower frequency from 880 on the dial down to 580 on the dial, which meant with 5,000 watts of power, they had the ability to cover about 6 states. So it really did influence, or I should say spread K-State's influence in a wide geographical area here in the rural Midwest.
And Ed, something you really had a firsthand look at, something unfortunately happening in 1968, a fire burning down Nichols Hall.
Yeah, Nichols is a landmark building on campus. Today, if you look at Nichols, it was nothing like it was on that fabled night way back when in 1968. The actual Nichols Hall, which was the home of the gymnasium where K-State played basketball previously. And so it had a big basketball court. And then on the, would have been on the west end, the west side of the building was the home of radio and television. KSAC, KSDB, which is the campus radio station, and also had elements of the K-State marching band in that wing. Well, on that fabled night, this was during a time of unrest on the K-State campus, and there were fires that were set around campus, many of them put out before damage was done. That night, the damage was done. The entire Nichols was engulfed in flames, and the only thing left the next day was the walls of Nichols. And that took down the radio stations as well, because they all fell, all the floors fell into the basement, and so you had radio stations that were completely destroyed. One of the great things about that, though, was KSAC at the time, the radio station, went back on the air the next morning and got things back going right away due to engineering. They could get some of those things done. So the fire didn't put the radio stations out of business. It just altered the plans. KSDB located to the K-State Library and we'll build a studio on the 5th floor of the K-State Library. So radio lived on through a night where it was estimated about 12,000 students visited the area during the fire because it was probably the largest fire in the history of Manhattan. In itself, a beautiful thing, in itself a devastating thing as well.
And a few years later, some good news for Kansas State University. In 1971, NPR, and how did K-State play into that?
You know, Jack Burke, the manager of the radio station that I originally knew, was very, very active in state and national broadcasting. And KSAC, because of its remarkable signal, really was quite a regional presence. The station had a lot of prestige. As late as the 1980s, if you worked at KSAC Radio, those were considered to be some of the top broadcasting jobs in the entire country, not just in public broadcasting, but in the radio industry as a whole. And so it's that kind of prestige that we're talking about. Well, with the passage of the Public Broadcasting Act of 1965 in the Johnson administration, originally that money was going to go only for public television. Jack Burke was one of those people who lobbied in Washington and said, no, you need to also be able to fund public radio stations. And so because of the fact that Jack was in on the ground floor of some of that, of some of those discussions, he had quite a bit of power and quite a bit of influence. And so this idea of creating a public broadcasting network, and K-State being one of the hubs of national public radio, because that's what it developed into, was quite a deal.
We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but when we come back, we'll be joined by Steve Smethers and Ed Klimeck as we continue to celebrate 100 years of K-State Radio. You're tuned back into Agriculture Today, and we continue our show and celebration of a century of sound and service for K-State Radio with Kansas radio broadcaster Ed Klimeck and K-State Broadcasting Professor Emeritus Steve Smethers. Steve, can you continue your conversation about how K-State radio programs and its people contributed to NPR?
Originally, Jack Burke and Ralph Titus, who was on the staff here as a program director of the station, both played a huge role in developing programs. I mean, all things considered, the afternoon news show on public radio actually was the idea that was promoted here from Manhattan. Weekend Edition initially was going to be broadcast from Manhattan till they realized it was going to cost so much for equalized telephone lines between Manhattan and the NPR studios in Washington that it was going to be cost prohibitive to do that. And so what we ended up with was all of these shows being done from NPR, but they had such heavy influence here from Kansas State University.
Then in the early 2000s, KKSU did leave the air.
So on November the 27th of 2002, KKSU left the air. And we forgot to mention, of course, that the station changed call letters at one time. A station in Sacramento, California, decided they wanted the call letters KSAC, and so they offered quite a sum of money to KSAC Radio to sell them the call letters. And so the university began identifying its radio station as KKSU.
Wanting to take the time to mention a few more monumental people for K-State Radio. You've already mentioned a few of them, but beginning off with Paul DeWeese and what he did for radio at K-State.
Wow. Paul DeWeese was a giant in farm broadcasting. He had the most mellow delivery on the air of anybody I think I've ever heard. You know, he had this ability to be kind of this authoritative voice of agriculture. When he would interview scientists and specialists here on the extension staff, for example, he had a way of bringing out information from these people. And then because he understood agriculture himself, he was able to translate that back so that the average listener could understand what the scientists were thinking. He was a great broadcaster. That nice, deep, mellow voice, I can still hear it right now.
And maybe someone not as much in agriculture, but really important to K-State Radio, Dev Nelson.
Yeah, Dev Nelson was a remarkable person. Dev was a lot of fun. You know, K-State has the distinction of being one of the first universities in America to distribute its play-by-play of football and basketball on statewide networks. And at that particular time, KSAC Radio was doing it. KSAC was broadcasting some of the games, and KSAC was playing a big role in distributing that to radio stations across Kansas. At that particular time, back in those days, K-State football was a terrible programming liability because our football team wasn't very good back in those days. My, how times have changed. Especially as football season approaches here, and with all of the hype that surrounds this coming football season, you think, was there ever really a time when K-State football was bad? And the answer is yes. And so to be distributing those games was not the easiest place to be. Our basketball games were distributed to statewide audiences, and of course that was a bigger deal because back then K-State basketball was pretty much the class of the old Big 8 conference. And so, Dev Nelson was the play-by-play voice of K-State. Paul DeWeese was his color man, his commentator. And Dev had this folksy, wonderful delivery. He had so many great sayings. And, when you listen to a game that was called by Dev and Paul, here were these guys who were used to communicating with rural Kansans in other ways on the radio station, doing K-State football and basketball games, and you thought these were the perfect people to represent Kansas State University on the air.
And Dev Nelson, considered the voice of the Wildcats, but can you tell us a little bit about the gentleman considered the voice of Kansas State University, Ralph Titus?
Ralph had been, of course, was a K-State graduate, K-State alum. He grew up down in Winfield, Kansas. And even as a little kid, he loved to play broadcasting. His father had made him a wooden microphone where he would do these pretend interviews with people. Here's this little tyke running around with his wooden microphone doing interviews. And so Ralph grew up as somebody who loved the idea of communicating with people. Before Ralph came back to work at KSAC Radio in the 1960s, he was an anchor at KWTV in Oklahoma City, Channel 9 in Oklahoma City, and was very good on the air, both television and radio. Ralph, in his long tenure here at KSAC, did so many great things. His documentary on the Eisenhower years that was run on National Public Radio won a Peabody Award, for example. Ralph was the instigator of so many great things and probably taught us all, helped us understand what else radio could do. We had an hour of classical music every day on KSAC called Music with the Masters. We had a wonderful, wonderful kind of a slant toward the arts on this radio station. So it wasn't all the latest on agricultural research for Kansas farmers. We had a wonderful news department on the radio station as well. And KSAC Radio was producing Perspective, which was a public affairs program that KKSU, of course, later ran and was also carried after the radio station left the air on the statewide network. That was hosted by Richard Baker here. Richard Baker was our news director here at this radio station for a long time. Before that, we had a fellow by the name of Don Brewer doing news here. So news, public affairs, the arts, sports, agricultural information. It was all there, and it was all about Kansas communities, Kansas families, and that to me is quite a legacy.
And as we get close to 100 years, having the opportunity to celebrate it here at Kansas State University, Ed, can you tell us some about what that event is?
Well, let's talk about there are 2 radio towers on the campus, and many people walk by those towers and sometimes don't even see them. They're kind of part of the landscape. But those 2 towers are right next to the Nichols Hall that we talked about earlier. And they are 100 years old this year. And in fact, they, I believe, are the only towers of that nature left in America. I think there's still some of those in South America, But in United States, I think that's the last of that generation. So that's a significant thing that those towers are actually still on our campus and that they've survived, because the last time they were actually used for radio broadcasting was 1947. And so they have been standing there basically without a use for all these years. And I've got to give full credit to our president, Richard Linton, because I did have the opportunity to meet with President Linton at the tower site. And I explained to him, we have these historic towers, 100 years old in 2024, and the history behind them and the fact that they really allowed K-State to be the voice of agriculture throughout the state of Kansas and beyond, because of the signal of 580, which was projected off of those towers. And President Linton said, this has got to be celebrated. And with that, we formed a committee, and President Linton helped us form that committee, and the planning for this 100th anniversary celebration began. But I want everybody, if you go to K-State or on the campus or come to Manhattan, look at those two towers right next to Nichols and envision those towers and what they really mean to the historical aspects of K-State.
When is this celebration taking place at those towers?
Well, we've put together a grand celebration, and we want the community, everyone, not just people into radio, but people into the history of K-State, the history of Manhattan, the history of Kansas, to come by. And that's going to be on Lucky Friday, September the 13th this year. And that celebration is going to be 1 hour long. And I'll touch on the lineup that day, because it's going to be just a wonderful celebration. We've got to kick off at 10 o'clock in the morning with our K-State pep band. They're going to get us all in the mood of Wildcat Land, and hopefully they are going to play the Wabash Cannonball. And I say that because the legend is that the only surviving piece of music from the K-State music department and the band to survive the Nichols fire was the Wabash Cannonball, and that's why it exists today. I don't know if that's truth or legend, but that is out there, and we hope they play that Wabash that morning.
We're cutting to another break on agriculture today, but when we come back, we'll still be joined by K-State Broadcasting Professor Emeritus Steve Smethers and Kansas radio broadcaster Ed Klimeck as he talks about the public celebration for 100 years of radio at Kansas State University that's taking place September 13th. If you're going to miss out on the rest of this conversation, you can always find the full show by going to agtoday.net. We're now cutting to that short break. We round out today's show of Agriculture Today in celebration of 100 years of K-State Radio with Steve Smethers and Ed Klimeck. Ed, as we continue our conversation on this public celebration on September 13th, what will follow the K-State Band?
The K-State Drama Department is going to put on a skit reflecting on the history of radio and starting back in the Dr. Brinkley days and what that all meant and what it was all about. And there should be somewhat of humor in that because Doc Brinkley did some humorous things with his attraction of business, let's say. So the drama department will be on stage. We actually have a stage that will be built. That will be followed up by Bill Buzenberg, who was with National Public Radio and has the history connection with K-State and National Public Radio. And he led National Public Radio for many years. So it's great to have him, a very dignified and K-State graduate, I understand as well, be on stage with us. Then the National Association of Broadcasters president, Curtis Leggett, is going to be in Manhattan for this celebration. That shows you the significance of this. So he'll have some comments. And then a person that has great notoriety in politics in Kansas, but also great notoriety because he actually worked with the old KSAC radio and also with the KKSU radio. And that is Sam Brownback. Sam was also the governor of Kansas and also a United States senator representing Kansas. So he'll be back. And then we'll follow up with Marshall Stewart, who is our Senior Vice President at K-State for Executive Affairs and also the Chief of Staff for K-State. A great celebration. It will conclude after 1 hour. We'll be singing the alma mater, and everybody is invited to attend. And also I would invite you, while you're here, to stop by the tower that's to the north and look at the KAB Memorial underneath that tower. That's been in place for many years and was just revitalized just a few years ago. And so there's a great memorial to the radio broadcasters and the radio stations of Kansas underneath that tower.
And when in that day on Friday, September 13th, does the event start?
That's at 10 a.m. and will go to 11.
If people are wanting to find out more information about the 100 years of radio at K-State or the event, where can they do that?
Go to the website, ksu.edu/radiocentennial, all one word. And it's all there, along with some of the great features that we've put out. Several people from various walks of life have done public service announcements that are being distributed to Kansas radio stations that talk about the storied history of this radio station. You can find all sorts of information there, bios on people who've worked at the station, kind of a timeline of the events that we've talked about. So it's a great website to visit.
Steve, Ed, I appreciate you both taking the time to join us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That was K-State Broadcasting Professor Emeritus Steve Smethers and Kansas radio broadcaster Ed Klimeck. Before we cut to a break, we're going to take the time to listen to the K-State Radiocentennial Minute that involves agricultural broadcasting.
Saluting a century of sound and service, this is a K-State Radiocentennial Minute.
Agricultural broadcasting has a long and storied history in Kansas, and it began at the state's land-grant university. On December 1st, 1924, KSAC Radio signed on the air, providing timely information for farmers and ranchers during what was called the Farm Hour. Over the decades, agricultural programming remained a mainstay of KSAC, thanks to several heralded voices, most notably Paul DeWeese.
Today, talk here with a K-State plant pathologist about take-all disease in wheat.
In 1961, the Farm Hour became known as Agriculture Today. That program endures to this day. I'm DeLoss Yonke, Vice President of the National Association of Farm Broadcasting and a K-State graduate. Learn more at kstu.edu/radiocentennial.
That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but in today's show notes on agtoday.net, I will put a link if you'd like to learn more about the century of radio at K-State. We'll be back with more for you tomorrow.